In this video, I'm going to show you how to remove and install Shimano cranks on a bicycle. There's a variety of reasons of why you may want to do this. You may be wanting to change the chain rings, change the bottom bracket, or just clean everything up real good. In my case, I'm getting a creaking noise from the bottom bracket, and it's been a long time since I've cleaned the bottom bracket shell. So I'm going to remove the cranks and then remove the bottom bracket, clean everything up real good, and reinstall. There's not a whole lot you're going to need to do this job. The main thing that you may not have is this little tool by Shimano. This is a Shimano TLFC16. They're pretty cheap, so pick one of those up if you don't have one. You'll need a 5mm Allen wrench. It's also a good idea to use a torque wrench. Torque specs on this are 12 to 14 Newton meters when you tighten everything back up. I would recommend some rubbing alcohol just to wipe everything down real good before you reinstall, and a little bit of grease to put on the splines before you reinstall the left crank arm, and maybe a plastic mallet or rubber mallet to tap out the cranks if they're tight. And as with most jobs, it is easier if you have a work stand, but it's not required for this one. If you have a work stand, go ahead and put the bike in the stand and remove the rear wheel. If you don't have a stand, you can leave the bike on the ground. Just be careful with the chain tension, which I'll show you here in a second. Now take the chain off the chain ring, and by the way, before you do this, go ahead and shift into the small chain ring. If you didn't, you can just do it by hand. But just lay the chain gently down onto the bottom bracket shell so it's off the chain rings. So you can see I have the chain just laying there on the bottom bracket shell. That way when you pull the cranks off, the chain is out of the way. Now if you've done this with the bike on the ground, just when you undo the chain from the chain ring, because you're going to have more tension on the chain with the rear wheel installed, push on the derailleur to take the slack out of the chain before you do this, and then gently let it back up. And again, that's only if you're leaving the bike on the ground or leaving the rear wheel in the bike. Now take your 5mm Allen wrench and loosen each of these bolts. And I try to loosen and tighten any kind of pinch bolt like this that has two, like on a stem or a crank. I do it very evenly. Even loosening, I don't want to put too much stress on one bolt by loosening one all the way and then doing the other. So go back and forth and about a half a turn each, maybe a whole turn, and loosen these bolts up. Once you've got them loose, you've got this little plastic piece in the middle. It's kind of a safety thing to hold the crank arm on. You're going to want to lift that up. Sometimes you can get your fingernail down in there. Sometimes it's necessary to take a really small flat blade screwdriver. But lift that up because that's going to allow the crank arm to come off. And you can see that piece is raised up in the middle. And you'll see it when we get it off, but there's a little pin that goes into the bottom bracket that holds the crank arm on just in case. It's kind of just a last resort measure of keeping that crank arm on. Now just take this little tool and loosen the cap, and the birds will cheer you on while you do it. Okay, and that's not going to be on there very tight at all. And there it is. So with the pinch bolts loosened, the top cap off, and that little plastic piece, you should be able to just kind of rock it back and forth and pull that crank arm off. For the drive side, it too should come out pretty easily. Sometimes you have to use a rubber or plastic mallet, and if you haven't laid the chain on the bottom bracket shell, make sure you do that before you get that one off. So this one, I'm just going to take my plastic mallet and just give it a couple little light taps, and that should bring it out. And when you get it to about right here, sometimes you just have to shake it back and forth, and there you go. And if you're kind of new to bike maintenance and you're curious of what a bike looks like with the bottom bracket removed, that's just an empty bottom bracket shell. I've removed the bottom bracket, and this is what the bottom bracket itself looks like. It's just a press-in cup, little sleeve in the middle, and identical cup on the other side. Reinstallation is pretty much the same thing, just in reverse order. Before you reinstall the cranks, no matter what the job you're doing, the reason you're removing the cranks, it's a good idea just to take a rag with some rubbing alcohol and just clean all around the bottom bracket shell, wipe out your your bearing cups and everything like that, because these are places that are hard to get to with the crank on in a normal cleaning procedure. So just take advantage of the crank being off to do that. So I'm going to make sure I hold the chain out of the way, and I'm going to take the drive side and just slide it through. And you may have to wiggle it back and forth, and it'll kind of jump in there. And you should be able to just press it on by hand, then put the chain on. Put the chain on the chain ring so you don't pinch it. And then just give it another good push. If it's not going on all the way, you can take a rubber mallet, plastic mallet. If you're going to use a plastic mallet, I would actually put a towel right here and just tap on the drive side. This one went in okay, but sometimes it might be a little tight, so you might just want to tap on it, get it seated in there real good. Before we put the left crank arm on, or the non-drive side, just take a little dab of grease on your finger and wipe it on the outside splines, and maybe another dab and on the inside where that little cap goes, and just kind of work it on there with your fingers. I'm going to put a little bit more right here, and then we'll put the left crank arm on. Okay, now I didn't show it in the video, but I also wiped out the inside of the left crank arm real good before I put it back on. Just make sure everything's clean. Again, take advantage of the cranks being off and just wipe them down real good with some rubbing alcohol. So make sure your cranks are lined up properly, and then just slide that on, and you should be able to push that on pretty good with your hands. And now we'll put the top cap on, and that'll seat it all the way down. Okay, the cap, I'm just going to lay on this tool and just tighten it down with your hand. This should, the cap should just be hand tight. Don't take a, pliers or anything, or giant pliers, and try to tighten this down. Just do it hand tight. And now push that little plastic thing down in there, and make sure it's all the way down inside. And now we'll just tighten the bolts. Now it's time to tighten the pinch bolts on the left crank arm. And you'll notice I did put the rear wheel back in the bike, and that's so that when I move the crank arm back and forth, the chain isn't sliding back and forth on the inside of the chainstay. So I'm going to use a regular 5mm Allen wrench and tighten these up just snug, and then I use my torque wrench to finish it up. So go back and forth, and once it starts to catch, do a quarter, maybe half turn at the most, and do these very evenly and get them snug. Now we'll finish tightening it up with the torque wrench if you have one. Shimano recommends 12 to 14 Newton meters on these. I'm going to do kind of right there in the middle at 13. And I recommend going back and forth twice on when you do this, because sometimes one pinch bolt will get tighter and then you need to tighten the other one. And by the way, what really holds the crank arm on is the pressure on that cap. I saw a guy one time who didn't have the cap. He lost the cap, and he tightened the pinch bolts real good, and the crank arm fell off within 10 minutes. So it's really that cap that holds the crank arm on. So that's how you remove and install Shimano cranks. Thanks for watching.